Are you ready? Okay. Okay, I'm going to do a short introductionary. Ani Kanawaya, Josh Eshkawkogan, Dao, Kiki Adre Langadendang, Dishnakas, Anishinaabe Nosin, Nimki Beneshin Dorem, Wiikwemkoong Da, me. Yeah, Wiikwemkoong Da, me, Medom Nesing, Manitoulin Island. I'm here today to talk to a couple of friends of mine that is here to learn about the Anishinaabe connection to the land in regards for these islands that we live on and that. So I welcome my friends, Jim Niles is part of the Great Lakes Alliance Coalition and that. And you're part of that also. This is Teresa.
Manitoulin Streams.
Manitoulin Streams. So they're very keen in understanding our connection in regards to understanding the Anishinaabe people and how the points of view of how things are in regards to their situation on the land. And it's always about the impacts of what's happening around the territory and that. And I guess my role in regards for this whole process today is to try and give enough information to my friends here to understand about the importance of history, where we come from and that. And part of that history is part of the Great Lakes in regards to how we traveled, how our ancestors traveled from where they came from and that. And if you look at the importance of that history of how they were connected to the land and how they traveled, and by utilizing all these islands coming from the States, all the way from Wisconsin, my own grassroots heritage of my ancestors, it was Onimki, came from Wisconsin and that. And that's my great grandfather, as far as back as of 1845, somewhere around there and that. And maybe even earlier, my great-grandfather brought in. And they had this travel from, like I said, from Green Bay, Wisconsin. So they had a lot of these little portages areas like Manitoulin Island, just like those canoes that's going by over there and that. You know, they have their own connection of where they had to stop. Manitoulin Island, Beaver Island. And there's a lot of history in that process of them traveling in that Great Lakes and that. Same with Mackinac Island. You know, there's a lot of history about Mackinac Island in regards to how the First Nations people were part of that 1812 war that took place in that. And that's where the First Nations people kind of helped the British to eliminate the encroachment of the U.S. into that part of that country. And then as they traveled from Mackinac Island all the way to Drummond Island, there's part of the history somewhere that there was 149 pipes lit at Drummond Island from all the First Nations people that was traveling through those Great Lakes. Now this is before the proclamation and that. There's history of that in regards to that. And that's the history part I'm talking about, that connection of our people on those land and how they connected to it that. And from Drummond Island to St. Joseph Island. You know, St. Joseph Island was another strong representation of where we came from. Yes, sir.
How is that history captured? Because this is the very first time I've heard about this connection.
Well, there's a lot of literature in regards for arts and museums. And also there's a lot of been research done in regards for, like, Wiikwemkoong Heritage Organization. They do a lot of research in regards for history, but also the language and that. And there's other organization that has a lot of history. The Algoma University has history in regards for portions of that, because they're a great big part of the settlements that have been taking place as early as 1850 and that. But these islands were always a connection to us, as our ancestors traveled from all these islands, like I said. And then all the way to St. Joseph Island, then all the way to Coburn Island, the west end of Manitoulin, and then from Coburn Island all the way to Manitoulin Island. And you know, that's the history of how that the Megas shell came true. The Megas shell is a symbol of life that was given to the First Nations people. And when they were going to go through that 7th prophecy that you were talking about, in regards for the history of our nation as Anishinaabe people, the Megas shell this is one of the landing spots that they did to do that ceremony of that life, that shell, and that. Now there's a lot of history that I'm leaving out in regards to how that came about. So you know, my main focus today was to make that connection with Jews to understand the importance of how Anishinaabe people feel about Manitoulin and that. And part of that whole process was understanding our treaties, because that's that main connection that people, First Nations people, understand is about the treaties in regards for the land and that, and how those treaties affected them in regards for that. Now, I don't want to get into the political end of what happened or whatever, in trying to understand the realistics of today. We live in a very universal world, and there's a lot of universal changes that's happening around us. In regards to understanding the connection to the land, that has not changed. Each individual person has a different emotion of how they're connected to the land. We use different teachings, different literature in regards for understanding other people's philosophy of what that is, the spiritual content of what that is. And for us as First Nations people, we always needed to identify ourselves as an identity. And when you have different levels of government confusing themselves in regards to what that is, whether it's a status card or a band membership, and you know, restrictions in regards for yourself as a Canadian citizen, you know, that has to be all addressed in a way of understanding each other, but understanding the connection of the land and that, and understanding why we have. Jim.
Can I jump in here?
Sure, please.
I'm going to read a little couple of sentences from this book, Braiding Sweetgrass, and then get your response to that.
Okay.
The author, Robin Wall Kimmerer, is arguing that our society, North American society, and around the world is in deep trouble. This industrial growth society is leading us into an unsustainable future with climate change and everything else. And the question I have is, well, how can we turn that around and maybe get to the point where we can survive and our kids and our grandkids can have a world they can live in? Her argument in this book is that the Indigenous wisdom might be the path that, if we could spread that around, would help us turn that corner and make the world a living place. And she says, what if we could fashion a restoration plan that grew from understanding multiple meanings of the land? Land as sustainer, land as identity, land as grocery store and pharmacy, land as connection to our ancestors, land as moral obligation, land as sacred, land as self. We could maybe, if we did that, have a shift from industrial growth society to a life-sustaining civilization. Do you agree with that?
I think, you know, in regards to what she's saying, I would say it's true in the sense of how she's delivering that message in that. But you know, acceptance in regards to what's happening now, accepting in regards to what is part of what we call progress. Some people call it progress in regards for people moving forward of having power. And I think that's the key thing in regards for us to understand. If we're going to be using people's philosophy or metaphor in regards to how they look after things, and we're kind of forgetting in regards to our own human instincts of who we are to be able to understand the importance of her message. And for governments or rich people that can afford that power, how destructive they are, and that without using any kind of spiritual content of the land and that.
Well, Do you think it's appropriation of the Anishinaabe way that's not appropriate? That, you know, white civilization should keep hands off, or do you think that the Indigenous wisdom, that the First Nations can teach that to the rest of society, and that's a worthwhile goal?
And again, are people ready to learn that? Are people ready to accept that?
Well, if they're not ready, we're screwed.
Well, of course we are, because we were screwed when 150 years ago, man. Now, we're
Never thought of it that way.
We're at a point in the world where we have to do something, or we are not going to survive.
And if you look at the prophecies from Socrates, all these people that has these prophecies of what's happening and that, and you know, our prophecy as Anishinaabe people is to learn from the history, and what's happening today. And what do you want to see for your children? And that's the portion that's missing in some of this power struggle that we're having in regards for economic issues versus cultural values. And that. Now, how do you combine those two into making it where everybody benefits in that whole process of progress is something that has to take time in order for it to happen. You're not going to have 3 billionaires sit in a room and talk about cultural value. You're going to be able to have 3 billionaires that want another billion for them. Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
Something, just because I taught finance,
Yeah.
you know, at McGill for so long, and one thing I came to realize, and I'm a woman, and I did not know that till I moved here, who loves water, that women have the responsibility of water.
Mm-hmm.
And what we teach at university and in accounting is that water has no price, no value, no cost. The only cost of water, so this would be for anybody manufacturing or mining or anything, is the delivery of it. But the water itself has no value in our entire economic system. It has no dollar value. If we change that one thing, then a lot of economic models would actually change. But we do not value water, the most life-sustaining thing there is. There is no price tag even put on. Even I'm not even suggesting that is the proper way to go, but that's huge. That water, the only value to water seen when you're making an economic decision is the cost of its delivery or its disposal once you've polluted it.
So how do you you measure value of that?
It's a big question. I can't answer that question because that's a big question. But I can see in the entire economic decision making scheme of the way things are done, the way decisions are made, if you have no cost assigned to it, then you're not going to value it when you're making an economic decision.
Would that go for any kind of resource?
Like
besides
air.
Like air.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That'll be the
like
next
the
one.
Basic resources are not assigned a dollar value, so therefore they can be wasted
Well, they're the commons
by corporations.
And
Or
individuals or corporations feel free to take from the commons and dump into the commons without paying for it. And that
Because
is an economic...
Because there's no penalty for doing so.
But you know, that's not sustainable.
No, and because the assumption is that it is sustainable. So
So anyways, yeah, it's very difficult to try and keep that balance in regards to whatever value that we're considering. Like water is not a value to us. Well, water is life. So, and you know, it was a time when our elders would say, well, I would say probably in the next 20 years, this is in the 70s, they would say, there'll be a time when we have to pay for water. They seen that happening 30 years ago.
Well, I think Therese is not arguing for Nestle taking water and selling.
No.
She's arguing for an economy that respects water and realizes it has value. And maybe the only way to get people to recognize that value is to put a dollar amount on it.
thank you. Exactly. It's like, so I understand how, you know, big decisions are made for investment. And if you're not putting any value on water, then you're not going to value it at all. So that, yes.
So you feel there's no value with Nestle, Avena,
Nestle's
Dasani.
a perfect example
Yeah.
of just taking the water, bottling it, all of this. It's like a total
Taking something
nightmare.
that belongs to all of us
Yeah.
and selling it
But
for
the
profit.
bean counters, who I help to teach, are never going to put a value on it unless we do. It's somehow in society.
And how did that structure develop?
Yeah, how did that structure develop?
From the government.
Well, this kind of
From all of us, from capitalism
Yeah,
to some degree.
exactly.
It's just, it is certainly the way we have.
it started
guess-
out with feudalism.
I guess
It started
actually-
out with feudalism and
Actually.
royalty,
Mm-hmm.
and where they took the land and claimed it as
There
their
you
own.
go. And I think
And
that's
then-
where Josh wants to bring us to. We came here and saw it was all good for the taking, and we took.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
And they did it in any way or form of how they can do that.
I just want to say something that's really bothering me in current political times is in America, when they're talking all these racists, and they're saying it's basically white supremacy, but nowhere do I hear actually when they say go back where we came from. The only people who can say that are the Anishinaabe of America.
Yeah.
So this ridiculous white supremacist argument is so ridiculous.
Yeah. And if you look at today's society, how do you break that barrier?
We gotta start teaching this.
Okay. And I totally agree with you, Jim, in regards. I know you were really connected in regards to what that lady wrote in that book.
Well, it's the wisdom.
This is the wisdom that,
teachings
yeah.
that are not getting into the general culture.
Okay.
I think, and I think that it's a treasure that needs to be shared.
Okay, so we're
Because I
talking
don't know
about.
if there's any other way of doing it, of
Yeah.
changing this worldview that's leading us.
So what you're saying is, how do we get this teaching to the general public?
Yeah,
And who's going to deliver that?
yeah.
These are the things that you need to do, that you're saying, in order for people to acknowledge that. So you have to have some kind of a formalization of people that can deliver the importance of understanding that message.
Curriculum. Somebody to develop a curriculum.
Yeah, to deliver that. Now you need to find the right people that can do that. Now, how you promote it into where is something that you need to take a look at. Do you put it into the churches? Do you put it into the schools? How do you bring it into their homes? In that, and I'm in that level right now to try and change the philosophy of these people's mind of today in regards to how they look at their neighbor or how they look at each other as a nation to nation. And that. And the size of Manitoulin, the communities on Manitoulin, what type of connection, understanding do they have to their neighbor, which is red and white. So that division has to come to consensus in regards for understanding those levels of connection to the land in regards to what those wisdom of what is in that book and that.
All of this history
Yeah.
should be taught in every school on this island.
Exactly. And
Well, even wider than that, I mean, Manitoulin is important, but it's also just a small part of the bigger world, which is having all these problems. I think, but you got to start somewhere.
yeah, and I think you need to start in your your backyard first. You know how we develop ourselves in regards to educating the other people that lives with us on Manitoulin. We have many good people that lives on Manitoulin Island, but there's also many people that don't understand the lifestyle of Manitoulin and that, and because of the nation of people that lives in that diversity island.
And right now we're going through an economic boom, an economic land boom on Manitoulin.
Yeah,
And that has its own problems with people
Yeah.
trying to exploit that and develop
Yeah.
it and
Right.
not just for the money. And certainly
That's treating land as a commodity. That
yes,
is just,
and that's
you
happening.
you buy it at one price and sell it at another. You just
I think by the design of the Anishinaabe community that cannot happen, right?
again, a design of the Anishinaabe people in regards to their communities It's designed by the government, in a sense. Our political role in regards to who we are is designed by the federal government. You know, some of our concept of our leadership, some people will call our chiefs INAC chiefs,
What's that?
Indian Affairs, Indian agents, because most of our political structure in regards for financial structure, for us to run as a functioning government, all that money comes from the government, from the federal government. So, you know, do you really totally have your own government structure as a First Nation, from my government to your government? And how does the third level government falls into your level of government, such as the municipalities of Manitoulin, Takma, Gore Bay, Asegnac, and that? And if you look at that, their priority is the land. And that's because of the taxes that they have to pay. Here,
So you know that's with regards to the development of Manitoulin as a whole.
mm-hmm,
That there cannot be, given that model of taxes, get more.
mm-hmm,
There's no room then for protecting the land. Why do people want to be here? Because it's beautiful and unspoiled.
Right.
Who's going to protect that?
The townships want taxes.
They want taxes.
Yeah.
They
Which
don't
is
care
sell
about-
more land and
yeah.
develop it.
Do you recall the 1990 treaty agreement that they had with the provincial government?
I'm sorry, you can assume that I don't know anything about any treaties.
Seriously?
Seriously.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Okay. So
Teach me.
that agreement in regards for access to roadways along the shorelines of all the lakes and waters around Manitoulin Island. Part of that agreement in the 1862 treaty was forgotten by the government in regards to that access of these lakes and that. So there comes to 1990, there was this agreement that was going to be put in place, but there was also a question in regards for land that First Nations people buy within Manitoulin. And the stipulations how they could do that was, if it's adjacent to their land, they can go ahead and purchase that. So, for example, AOK bought a parcel of land from a farmer, John Wilkin, on that side of their land, and that he sold it, so they bought it. The municipality of that land had a issue with that, because First Nations people were not going to pay taxes now because it's their land. Now, the taxes from that municipality, which is Howland more than likely, has an issue with that. That's still in the courts.
Really?
Really.
What
It's
year
in
did
the-
you say?
1990, 1992, 93.
Louise.
Yeah. So that's still in the court system. The 1862 treaty that was signed in Manitoulin by the other First Nations people. Wiikwemkoong never signed that treaty and that. So there again, there's legal implications in regards for monetary exchange when that treaty was signed. Wiki never took that money in regards for that. But the government puts it as a trust fund within their own treasury budget and that. And the same thing with those First Nations people that were forgotten in that 1862 treaty, which was the Salt Bay Band. They were living on Clover Valley. They were never even acknowledged in that 1862 treaty, so they had monies in place there in regards for in trust by the government. Sucker Lake Reserve, a family of 4. They lived in just past Manitoulin, towards that dump area road. There used to be a First Nations people there. That was never acknowledged in that. So there's a lot of history that is not being in place. So that 1862 treaty put an implication in Wiikwemkoong not to be part of that, gives them that word unceded, meaning never had an agreement, a treaty or a document saying to them. The only agreement that Wiikwemkoong recognizes is the Bondhead Agreement, which was the 1836. All these First Nations people that were traveling, that was staying on the mainland, like mainland meaning Blind River, Sault Ste. Marie, around that area, and then you see Garden River, that's part of the mainland. But these people traveled from these Great Lakes. They traveled all the way on these islands in regards to that. It's not that they owned them, but they always used them
Right.
and that, and that's, and when,
Can I,
yeah, please. Go
Can I
ahead.
go back, way back in history?
Sure.
We know that the original First Nations people came from the west, from across the Bering Straits,
Mm-hmm.
13,000 years ago,
Okay.
or whatever, and spread across North America and South America over that time period.
Mm-hmm.
And what I remember reading about the settlement of the Great Lakes area is that the people came from the east and came westward. And I don't understand how the people came from the west and then ended up coming back from the east to settle in Manitoulin. That's part one. Part two is how long did Aboriginal people live on Manitoulin? Does it go back 1,000 years, 500 years, 5,000 years? How long back does it go? These are tough questions. They bug
The only answer I can give you is in regards to whatever documentation that we have would come from the Jesuit people,
Yeah,
because they're the ones that made first contact with First Nations people at Manitoulin.
but there's no. You see that there's the prehistory. Is what I
The prehistory of it,
the paleo.
it'll be just as good as a guess as yours or
Yeah.
Teresa's or mine or Patrick in regards to how that came about. And then that's the part that I always say, the history in regards to what we find out at the time is what that
Is
history
there
is.
any archaeology that shows how far back
Yes.
settlement goes?
There was a settlement found in Eshkawkogan that's dated
10,000 years old. Yeah.
And something in Providence Bay about 5,000.
Yeah, I don't know
Yeah.
much about that one, but
Yeah.
I remember hearing about
But
that.
there is history in parts of, like I said. And for me not to know the history of Manitoulin, there's two museums that I know that's on Manitoulin. One in Manitoulin, and one in Eshkawkogan. I'm 63 years old. I've never been into one of those museums. So you can call it arrogance, you can call it whatever you want, but it's up to us as individuals to be able to find that connection of history, to find that connection of where do we come from.
How did the people live here? Did they live in long houses or what
Like
kind of,
the-
what kind of shelter? They're not teepees. Teepees.
No, teepees is not. It wasn't ours. Teepees were sort of more our,
Temporary.
yeah,
It's just like
wigwam.
camping.
It's like a wigwam.
But how did people survive the winter? I thought
Long
many
houses,
of
I think, didn't they?
long houses.
Well, I don't know. I've just read a couple fictional
Yeah.
novels that talk about the longhouses. I don't really know.
But there is no magic in regards to knowing how they survived. I think it was all about survival in regards for the winter, and how they survive is with either through what I remember is the wildlife that was around them. I remember families going to the south end of the reserve, bringing in home 8 to 10 deer for their winter. And I would remember they used to have an ice shack right at the front of the water treatment plant. And that's where everybody got their ice. They would store their ice and cut that ice in the.
Sawdust, right?
Yeah, I remember all that. And how the water, we never had any water plants or whatever. Our first water delivery was by a horse and a wagon. And the guy that delivered the wagon, the water, there used to be 4 barrels on his wagon. Back up the horses up to the water. We as young boys would load up the barrels and take it to the homes and that. So that was part of survival. And how we survived in the wintertime, our ancestors, is through salvaging whatever food that they planted in the summertime. Everybody would have a cellar. I remember my grandfather's cellar, which was down the house and that. And we had to go down there, take all the rotten potatoes out of the way. There would be a bin for apples. And that's what it was. Our fruit was apples. He had a special tree that we couldn't touch, and that was for the winter.
Oh.
Yeah, but there was all kinds of apple trees. We were allowed to go get those ones if we wanted to. So it was about survival. And in regards for our way of habit of eating, and that's changed quite a bit. We all know that. We have so much diabetes within our communities now. We have so much amputations happening just like that. You know, so the balance of life itself is out of whack in regards for that. And how that came about, through history. It didn't happen overnight. You know, how colonialism kind of affected us, how it's still affecting us, and the changes that's happening. Same with the...
So I'm going to ask a hard question here.
Yes.
You've got the teachings, the wisdom that are powerful.
Mm-hmm.
But even within your community, there are still problems. How come the teachings are not working? How come they're not getting the people?
Can just interrupt on something? I don't know when this happened, but of course there's the whole residential school system, which broke the community,
That's
right?
right, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that's part of the colonialism, like I'm talking about, part of genocide and that. Now, what your question is in regards to how come the community is not changing? Well, you know, it's to me, it's up each individual to accept the change or whatever they need to change. So if they're not ready to change, they're not. Okay? If I'm ready to change in regards to the way I live, whether it's through an addiction, whether it's through alcoholism, if I don't believe in Jesus Christ, what do I believe in? You know, that's the change I'm talking about. So in order for people to change their way of accepting things and trying to make that change, if you can make that change within yourself, like I'm doing, and trying to make that change with other people, the connection that you have within yourself of how I'm connected to the land, how I'm connected to these animals, how I'm connected to you. Everything happens in a reason of how we can transform that energy of change to each individual, whether it's a community, whether it's a nation, or a different race. So if I find something that's really makes me feel good in a connection of change, I'll take that. But if they're not ready to take all these teachings, the 7 grandfather teachings, the 7 life stages of life changes we have, if they're not ready to take a look at that, you need to be able to figure out how they're going to open their own mind and their own heart, how to change that.
I found from reading these things,
These books, yeah.
that my life changed.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it reinforced what I was already leaning
towards, yeah.
But I found it life-changing, and it makes sense, and it provides some kind of overall framework, worldview that, for me, fits.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that could be shared with other people, and they might get it too, you know. But if they'd have to know about it and understand it in order for that to happen. I don't know. You know, traditional Christian upbringing never worked for me. It didn't.
Me neither.
Me neither.
It didn't connect.
No.
This
We're
does.
Catholics, you and I, right?
Dad
By
was
name.
like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. But I think it is changing. Maybe it's not fast enough. But here on Manitoulin, with like Lakeview School and Eshkawkogan, and now they've opened that camp to help kids with addictions, right? Like that Jesse Bourdain, I don't know, that is running. It's changing, and the way I think you're going to succeed in changing it is through the kids. And what I see happening from my little bit of experience at Eshkawkogan that I thought was a marvel is the kids are teaching the parents how to change, and that's amazing.
And that's the change I'm talking about. You need to change that change you want to promote to by the eighth fire. And I keep coming back and referring back to the 8th fire.
And I'm sorry, for me, can you back up and can we go to the 7th fire and just say
yeah, there was a prophecy. If you find it in the Missionaries book, and now you'll see the
read it. I don't remember.
Yeah, you know, and there's the prophecies that was in place by the ancestors of First Nations people in regards for the first prophecy of that human contact, that first European contact, whatever.
Right.
And all those stages came
Was
into...
Manitoulin 4th? Something was food on water? Was that part of it?
could be.
It's in this book.
Yeah, that's that mega shell that I'm talking about earlier.
I wonder.
Those stages of where they stopped, eh?
Right, yeah.
And it started from St. Lawrence River all the way down to that's another totally different long story. Yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna say, that almost everything they're bringing into schools or drug addiction all has a land-based component. Land-based counselors.
Yeah.
So that's a very important part of it. And I'm just going to go back to, I just wanted to say that how do you change people? It's almost like, being born again.
Yeah.
People have to be born again
In
to
order
the
for
land, make that connection, and then the gratitude follows. You're thankful for all these things around you. You're thankful for beauty. You're thankful for
color, everything.
Everything.
Yeah.
So, but that's like that's a revolutionary kind of thing that doesn't happen easily in a lot of people.
Takes a little bit of time to actually see the results of that.
You have to be
change.
exposed to it.
Yeah.
Which
Well,
is
that's true.
There's we are lucky, you and I.
After
We're
the exposure,
exposed to
though,
it.
Patrick, how do you get that rebirth?
Well, I mean, you were talking about this book and it's changed you, but what I find in a lot of kids is they no longer can make those pictures in their mind when they're reading.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I used to read, when I read Tolstoy or Solzhenitsyn, or I like a lot of the Russians or Germans, but I can make those pictures. I think a lot of people don't have that ability. So then the challenge is to mine that book in such a way that you can extract those resources and deliver them to people in a way that they can consume it. Because reading, I'm just so skeptical. I have two smart kids, but they don't read a lot.
Yeah.
I know what you're saying, for sure.
God, I can't imagine not reading. But that's me.
So we talk about connections in regards for like the book. There's many different authors out there in regards for understanding the perspective of what life's about. Indigenous knowledge keepers that promotes their knowledge in regards to what they've learned through life and that. So we all have these gifts in regards for that, and how we open a person up in that revolutionary you're talking about. For us, it's ceremony. For something that we do in a very ceremonial way, and that's that spiritual connection. So whenever you're in that spiritual ceremonial place, that interconnection of that spirit, all comes into that connection. And when you give yourself to ceremony in regards for your prayers and suffering, to be out in the hot sun for 4 days with no water, what else can that person offer to society? What is that person can offer to help those people? And that's just by giving themselves to the natural law, through the sun, through the pain, through the suffering of the dancing and so forth.
Are you saying that the ceremonies, in order to work, have to be painful?
That's just the process in regards to it. When I go to church, do I have to kneel down? When I go to church, do I have to make the sign of the cross? So if I go to ceremony, if that's the process of me dancing in that sun, that's my choice. So if I want to suffer into that ceremony, again, whose choice is that?
But if you go through a sweat lodge, that's a ceremony.
Yes.
Yes. And it's intended to change people?
No. A sweat lodge is an intent to know yourself within. So when I say that, when a person goes into that lodge, into that sweat lodge, you're going in there to pray for yourself. You're in there to be a born again, if you wish to call it that way, person that is looking for healing, that's looking for answers, that's looking for direction, that's looking for balance. And then in that realm of that lodge is the spiritual intent of that lodge. And it's just the same way as you go to that church Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. And so it's all in each individual's intent in regards to how they find themselves in that connection. You found yourself in regards to what you believed in regards to that book, which is awesome, which is wonderful. And so in regards to how we connect, whether we through suffering or ceremony, or we go to a very delicate sweat lodge, it's no different in regards for a person that's going into a sauna to relax, to just to unwind. It's the same thing in the lodge. It's the same thing, but a different form of ceremony than that. And again, each society has a different way of that connection and that. Each race has a different way of connection and that. But in reality, no matter what color or what race you are, there's creation. And who created that? It doesn't. I don't think it was that black god or that yellow god or that red god or whoever. There was a creation that created that. And how me, you, and everybody in this world, how they connect with that creation is something that we need to take a look at. And once you can do that, you can open other people's hearts. You can open other people's minds in regards for understanding. Oh, look at that spider. Look at that squirrel. Look at those two birds chasing each other. Look at that eagle going by. All that creation is how you acknowledge that. So when you do these religious or righteous way of connecting, there is no limit. There's no boundaries in regards to how you do that. And whatever you encounter in a sweat lodge is something spiritual within you. That's that spiritual. If I brought those grandpas or grandmas, however I identify them, those hot rocks, into that lodge, and I put them in place and I put my medicines on that, and how I connect into that realm of those spirits, those grandpas, those ancestors coming in, every one of us will have a different connection. I will see something that you don't see. You see something that I can't see in that. Oh, there's a shape of a buffalo head. Oh, there's a shape of a bear. And there's that glow. There's that glow of something. So you can't measure in regards for our capabilities of who we are. We just have to learn to accept that and acknowledge that, and then share with that when the time is right. And that's how we kind of study our experiences in a very kind, gentle way, by dissecting it within your own mind and accepting it in your own spirit of through the breath of life. And that's how we start, is by understanding that breath of life within you to be able to experience whatever is there in that.
Can I ask you some practical questions?
Sure, please.
Okay, a little slightly.
Can I ask you a question?
Well,
Please,
yeah,
the table's open.
You won't like it. It's a big question.
Well, let him answer. Let him ask questions first.
Well, my questions are practical about. The first one is about the upcoming meeting on August 8th for the group, and I'm hoping that you can be there.
Is that for your island group?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And because of a lot of things. One thing I think I mentioned before is that it seems to me a theme or a focus of this group and then of the bigger whole island group ought to be this stuff.
Conversation, yeah.
The Aboriginal wisdom. And I think that could be powerful. And right now the big group really hasn't done anything of value that I can see besides having meetings. But this could be a way for them to start. And I think you'd have to be a leader of that in order for it to happen. So that's why I hope you'll be at the meeting and we can maybe bring this up as an idea for our group, and then maybe we can send that idea to the bigger group. So, can you come to the meeting on the 8th?
That's your question?
Yeah.
Practical.
That's a very practical question. Okay. I'll say okay. I'll be there at that meeting. Okay. I am scheduled to be at Rainbow Lodge Recovery Center. Whenever I have nothing to do, they ask me to stop by. So I can scratch myself for that day.
Well, this meeting is from noon, I think. No, there's a lunch. Can't remember if it's 11 or noon to about 2 o'clock.
So it's only a couple hours, whatever. Yeah. Well, that kind of messes up my day, but...
Where is it?
It's at the old church in Kagawang.
Kagawang.
A week from today?
Yeah.
Next week.
Is it a Friday?
Yeah.
It's a week from today.
Thursday, I believe.
8th Thursday, I think it is.
Yeah.
Yes. So if you come, could you do a little introduction of the Thanksgiving address, a little bit of that, just about.
I could give you an introduction in regards for whatever we need to do, and that I can.
You think we're still going, or should I stop?
That's what I mean. These questions are kind of nitty gritty rather than.